Venus flytraps must surely be one of the most iconic and unique species of carnivorous plant in the world. Fortunately, they're not that hard to grow, so long as you understand some important care tips which I'm about to discuss. Now, this is quite a comprehensive guide, but I've tried my best to explain it as simple as possible. Now, when used in combination, the following care tips will not only result in healthier plants, but more mature plants year after year. Now, whether you're thinking about growing Venus flytraps, you're just starting out, or you already have a couple of plants, the following care tips will help you grow Venus flytraps with the wow factor. My name is Jerry from Succulent Flytraps. So I'm just going to start off with just highlighting what healthy Venus flytraps should look like. This is a shark's teeth cultivar. You can tell by those triangular edges around the traps. You can see that the traps aren't deformed in any way. Some nice healthy growth. Though some of these traps are quite red. That's because these plants here, I grow them outdoors all year round, and they're getting around about 8 to 9 hours of direct sunlight every day. Of course, you can see the flies in the traps. Just shows you how efficient Venus flytraps are at catching their own prey. And of course, I've got some traps which are sealed up, indicating that they're digesting insects or whatever they've caught. Over here, I've got a beautiful pumice stone planter. This is a G16 times G14 cultivar. They're characterised by these very vibrantly coloured red traps. They're quite long, some of these traps. Of course, you've got some brown leaves, which is normal. As the traps get older, they get replaced with new growth. I started off with putting one rhizome into this pumice stone planter around about 2 years ago, and since then it really has flourished. There's plenty of shoots coming out of there. Again, there's a lot of traps which are sealed up, indicating that they're digesting insects. And if you look closely down here, there's even a cockroach. So it just shows you how diverse some of the prey that can get caught into these traps. Over here, I've got another beautiful cultivar. This is a G7 times G14 cultivar. Again, it's characterised by these beautifully coloured red traps. Not all cultivars are brightly coloured like this, but the ones that are, if you give them plenty of sun, they really do come up nicely. Again, the traps are nicely formed. Some are digesting again, but looking healthy overall. And over here, I've got a Acai Rue, which is a red dragon Venus flytrap. You can see those beautifully coloured dark red traps. That's the center of the rhizome there. Looking quite healthy. Again, you can see these old traps there. I tend to leave them on there. I know others like to remove those old traps. I'll get to that later on in the video. But I'm also going to have a look in my nursery as to how the other plants are looking, so you get a bit of an idea as how they look like. So I'm going to start off with one important growing tip which I find is most problematic with growers out there of Venus flytraps. I get to chat to a lot of people at the markets, and this common theme keeps coming along. So I thought it'd be very important for me to discuss it and clear it up. Now, Venus flytraps come from areas where there are changes in the seasons: summer, autumn, winter, spring, from North, South Carolina in the United States. So during the winter, where there is no insects to catch, Venus flytraps go dormant. They basically shut down their growth. Now, unless you understand that dormancy is necessary, then it's easy to assume that your plant is dying or you're just not looking after it. And what I've found happens to a lot of Venus flytraps, they get thrown out around winter. Now, I actually did this myself with my first flytrap all those years ago, and to this day, I still feel the guilt. It's not until later that I realized, wow, there was probably nothing wrong with that plant because it was going through through the dormancy period. If only I knew the life cycle of the plant. So here's a photo of some dormant Venus flytraps. You can see that there are a lot of these black or brown leaves. The plants are quite small. There's still a few green shoots around the rhizome. And what's important to understand is that there is no new shoots produced. It just basically just hibernates. It just sort of chills out. So now you understand what dormancy is, you know why it's important, and now you know what it looks like. So when you're growing your Venus flytrap, if it looks like this, looks dormant in winter, don't throw it out. So what's important to highlight that if your plant is to go through dormancy, you need to be growing it in an area where there are changes in the seasons, okay? Unless there are changes in the seasons, then your plant won't go dormant. And dormancy, as I said earlier, is necessary, so it rebuilds its energy reserves. If it doesn't go dormant, then eventually it will die. So I grow all my plants outdoors all year round here in Sydney, Australia. And because there are changes in the seasons, these plants automatically go dormant. They're able to pick up the seasonal changes, the temperature changes and the light changes, and then they go dormant. So it's just something to be aware of. So as I said earlier, I grow my plants outdoors all year round. So how much light do I give my plants? So I grow all my plants in direct sunlight. I give my plants around about 8 to 9 hours of direct sunlight. As a minimum, you should be giving your plants 5 hours of direct sunlight. As a general rule, the more sunlight you give your plants, the more vibrantly coloured they'll be and the healthier they'll be, okay? Now, sunlight also gives energy to the plant. It's because it hasn't got trace elements like nitrogen. That's the reason why it's evolved to catch insects. So that's why I say the more sunlight you can give your plants, the healthier they'll be. Now, if you're growing your plants indoors, which is what you can do, make sure that it's on a north-facing windowsill here in the southern hemisphere and vice versa in the northern hemisphere. That way it's going to get morning, afternoon, and maybe a bit of afternoon sunlight. And as I said, the minimum amount of sunlight is 5 hours. So in addition to direct sunlight, these plants are also able to withstand higher temperatures. So summer's just gone now and we experience temperatures of around about up to 38 degrees Celsius. Looking at the plants, there's no evidence of any leaf burn. So these plants, as well as being able to withstand those extended periods of sunlight, they're also able to withstand those higher temperatures as well. So one question I get asked a lot at the markets when I'm selling my carnivorous plants is whether you can put Venus flytraps into the ground or whether you can use normal potting mix. Now, to understand why you shouldn't be using those mediums, you have to understand why carnivorous plants have evolved to be carnivores at all. The reason is because that the medium that they normally grow in is devoid of any nutrients. Now, to get around that, they've evolved to catch insects. And it's the insects that provides vital trace elements such as nitrogen for healthy plant growth. So by using potting mix or any medium that's got nutrients in it, it's going to burn the roots of the plant and that's going to result in deformed traps. What I use and what you should be using is a peat moss based medium. So I use 3 parts peat moss to 1 part perlite. Perlite is what aerates the peat moss. Or lately what I've been experimenting with is 1 part perlite to 1 part peat moss, just a 50-50 mix. And I've experimented with both, and both of them work pretty well, those ratios. The perlite is what aerates the peat moss, and it also provides sufficient drainage. At the same time, the peat moss is what provides the acidity, which is what the plants love. Now, as I said before, they don't like too many nutrients in the medium that they're growing in. So what I normally do, I just give the perlite a good rinse. I just place that perlite into some fly screen over a sieve, and then I just use a hose to rinse out all the contaminants. Just keep hosing it until the water coming out from the bottom turns to be clear. It's going to turn out milky from the start, but over time it'll turn out clear, and that's when you know that the perlite has been given a good rinse. So how much water should you give your Venus flytraps, and what's the best way to water them? Venus flytraps come from savanna wetlands, and the medium that they're growing in is pretty much damp at all times. So what's important is that you never allow the peat moss medium that they're growing in to ever dry out. It's the quickest way to kill your plants. Now, the easiest way that I've found to have that peat moss damp at all times is simply by placing your pot plant into a tray. All you have to do is make sure that there's water in that tray. Of course, the water is going to be absorbed through capillary action, and it's going to keep your plant nicely hydrated. Now, another way of watering your plants is by watering it from the top onto the plant itself, all around the plant. Now, what I've found though is as the water's coming out of the spout, a lot of the times it will fall onto a trap, that water, and as it does, it will cause that trap to trigger and close. And I don't really like to see that happening, because I know that the plant is spending unnecessary energy closing, then reopening that trap. So to avoid that, I just simply used the water tray method. So what's the best water to use for your plants? So as I said before, Venus flytraps, like a lot of carnivorous plants, have evolved to capture insects because the medium that they're growing in is low in nutrients. So if you use tap water, for example, that's got high levels of dissolved salts in it, if you use that to water your plant, the high levels of dissolved salts, all those nutrients, are going to burn the roots of your plant, causing the traps to get deformed. So tap water is classified as hard water. What's best to use is soft water. Soft water is a term used to describe water that's got low or minimal levels of dissolved salts in it. Rainwater, reverse osmosis filtered water, and distilled water are all examples of soft water that you can use for your plants. Okay? Now, if you've got water that you're not quite sure whether you should be using to water your plants, what you can use a special meter called a TDS meter. And what that does, that measures the levels of dissolved salts in the water. So as a general guide, you want to use water that's got a reading of 50 parts per million, 50 ppm or less. That's best to use for your plants. If it's got a reading of more than that, 50 ppm, then it's probably better to consider another option. So while it's important to never allow your peat moss to dry out, what I've found and what I've experimented with is if you allow the water tray to completely evaporate of water after around about, say, 2 days, and then rewatering it again, you encourage the Venus flytrap to develop stronger, thicker roots as it looks for water. So you're basically making your plant work harder for that water source by allowing that water tray to dry out. Not allowing the peat moss to dry, but just that water tray, okay guys? And as I said, it forms those thicker roots, and after it forms those thicker roots, it actually encourages more rhizome development from the main stem of the plant, and then you end up getting multiple plants. And that's exactly what happened with this single rhizome that I planted in this pumice stone planter a couple of years ago. The pumice stone acts like a barrier to the water, even though it's porous, but it sort of acts like a barrier because there's also air in there as well. And the plant has had to fight harder for that water source that's formed those thicker roots, and as a result, it's formed all these multiple offshoots and multiple plants, and it looks absolutely beautiful. And you'll get the same result with your plant if you sort of allow that water tray to dry out every now and again. So what's the best pots to use and the best pot sizes to use for Venus flytraps? For all my plants here at my nursery, I use plastic pots, and all my plants are growing really well in it. Plastic, being an inert material, is ideal for carnivorous plants that are sensitive to too many dissolved salts or minerals in the potting medium. Now, you can use glazed pots. I wouldn't use terracotta pots, because being porous, it can sort of leach minerals over time into the peat moss, and that can harm your plants. Now, for pot sizes, Venus flytraps don't have an extensive root system like North American pitcher plants. However, they do like a little bit of depth for healthy growth. So as a minimum, I recommend using 140 millimeter high pots for healthy growth of your plant. Now, over here, I'm using a 200 millimeter high pot, and I've got multiple big mouths in here, and they're growing really, really well. What's useful to know is that these larger pots, having more potting medium in there, provides better insulation for the roots of your plants. By having more potting medium in there, it insulates the roots because there's less temperature variation within that pot. And the more stable the temperature is around the roots of your plant, the healthier your plants are going to be. So hopefully your plant is producing lots of traps, except of course during winter when it starts to go dormant. Now, over time, like any other plant, Venus flytraps have older leaves which start to brown off and start to get black eventually. And then you may want to think about removing them to make your plant look more presentable. Now, for me though, what's more important is the functionality of the plant. Sometimes the old leaves can get in the way of the functioning ones, and I tend to focus more on them than the other ones which are just sort of sitting there. Now, I've got a link to a video in the description box, and that really goes into detail about how I go about removing the old leaves from Venus flytraps. So before I start, I'm just going to give you a quick rundown here of what I use. I just use a pair of scissors. I also use some tweezers, okay? So these two tools will help you to remove those old leaves while minimizing the disturbance to the other traps. As you saw earlier, just pouring water from the top can cause some of those traps to trigger. Of course, what's important is that you sanitize the equipment. I just use alcohol, which I rub onto the blades or the ends of the tweezers. So let's just go now and have a look at how I'll go about removing the old leaves. Okay, so as you can see here, there are old leaves here. Some are quite old. They're the ones that are sort of crinkled up like this. And some, of course, have just started to brown off around the ends of the trap. And there's still a little bit of color around the leaf base there, okay? So depending on how old those leaves are, that will determine how easy they are to remove. So these ones, which are pretty well black all the way and they're quite crinkled up, just a matter of just remove them by hand. Okay, see how easily they come off from the center of the rhizome. Now, you can use your hand here. Of course, you can use tweezers as well. And by doing it this way, you're sort of, as I said, minimizing any disturbance to any other traps. Here's another one over here. So I'm just going to remove that by hand. Just like that. So here's a good example of one over here. It's quite crinkled up, it's quite crispy. So it's just a matter of pulling it out. See how easy that is? There's a few over here. I'll just use my tweezers for this one. Just go in there a bit. Just get the end there like that, and then just, whoops, that one's not coming out, not as old as I thought it was. There we go, just like that. And as you can see, it's getting more presentable here, and you're not really triggering any of those traps. But even if you do, that's okay, guys. It's just, I just like to think that the plant is conserving as much energy as it can and using that energy to actually catch insects, okay? So it doesn't matter if you trigger any of those traps, all right? Now, see these other ones here now? So this is the one that it's not as old, but you still may want to remove it. So in that case, what you can do here is just grab the tip of it like that and then just cut off the leaf base like that. That removes quite easily. Same over here. Just grab the end there like that, and then just carefully with the tips of the scissors, just cut off that leaf base like that. Okay. Another one over here. Just cut off the leaf base. Just use the tips of your blades. Don't want to cut into any other sort of new tissue. That's basically all you got to do. Okay, so that just gives you a rundown of how I go about pruning my Venus flytraps. So after I remove all the leaves, I like to reuse them to make a really nice mulch around the base of your plant. So for more information about how I actually reuse these leaves and how I actually store them, go to that link in the description to the video about how I actually go about pruning Venus flytraps. So the big bonus about growing Venus flytraps outdoors, and that's where I recommend you grow them, is that you don't have to worry about feeding them. They're very effective at attracting and catching all sorts of insects. As you saw earlier in the video, you could see all the remnants of those flies and even that cockroach. Having said that, you may notice some plants aren't catching anything. There's nothing actually in those traps, so you may want to consider feeding them. So I'm just going to go over a few tips when it comes to feeding Venus flytraps. So the important thing to remember when feeding your Venus flytraps is whatever you put into those traps either has to be alive or there has to be stimulation of that trap for digestion to occur. So you may put something in there, for example, that is dead. It will trigger the trap, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to stimulate digestion because it's dead. Whatever you put in there, it's not moving around. So I recommend, whenever you're feeding your fly traps, to first try and find live insects wherever you can find them. I recommend getting yourself a fly swatter. Just swat them lightly if you can. So you don't want to kill them. Put them inside the traps, and because they're alive, they're actually going to get digested. In early spring, I found a lot of caterpillars in my backyard on my North American pitcher plants, and as soon as I found them, I thought, great, I can use them to feed my fly traps. So always be on the lookout for anything that you may find in your backyard or wherever that you can use to feed your fly traps. Being alive is always best. Now, having said that, if whatever you have, whatever food item you have isn't alive, there is a way of getting around that where you can stimulate the trap for digestion to occur. I'm going to show you how to do that. Okay, so if you've got a food item that isn't alive and you want to stimulate the trap, I'm just going to show you how to do that. Here I'm using bloodworms. Just got that on a toothpick. And what I'm going to do to stimulate the trap is I'm just going to use a little bit of fishing line here. And I'm just going to show you how this is done. As far as I know, I don't think anyone else does this. I just discovered this by accident, this technique, but it does work. Okay, so as you're putting in those bloodworms, put in that fly line at the same time, or the fishing line, and then that will close. Gently take out that toothpick. Now, that fishing line that's still in there, with your fingers, start giving that a bit of a twirl inside. Okay? Now what that does is that imitates a struggling insect inside. that fishing line is actually brushing past those trigger hairs inside, so that should cause that trap to start digesting. So just keep doing that. Do that for about a minute or two, just to really let that plant know there's something inside there. Just keep twirling it. And you should start to see that trap starting to seal up around the edges. So hopefully now you're starting to see that around the edges here, it's starting to seal up. And that will get tighter and tighter, and then that's when you know that digestion is occurring. Okay guys, so just use this technique. Works pretty well. Just give it a good twirl once that line is inside the trap, and you should have a happy plant. So now you have a bit of an idea about how to stimulate those traps for digestion to occur for any food items which aren't alive. If you're going to be growing these plants indoors and you're not seeing prey items within those traps, you're going to have to think about feeding them for healthy, vibrant plants. Now, how often should you feed your plants? Well, think about, through my experimentation anyway, I feed around about 2 leaves on the one plant per feeding session, and then you can wait about 10 days and then refeed them again. I only do this experiment. I don't actually feed my plants normally, but it was just through experimentation, and it seems to be working well, that frequency of feeding. Having said that, I see a lot of my plants with, say, around about 80% of their leaves sealed up, indicating that they're digesting something. So that indicates to me that you can probably feed them more. So if you're going to do that, you're going to experiment, do a gradual increase. So you may want to do 3 leaves in one feeding session, wait 10 days and repeat it. Don't give them all those leaves food items and see how you go. It's probably going to be too much for the plant. You want to do a gradual increase in the feeding. Now, a big no-no when you're feeding your fly traps is never to give them human food items, things that we would normally eat, say meat, cheese, or whatever. The plants just haven't evolved to digest those food items. And if you put those food items in there, not only will it not digest, but anything that's not digested is going to attract things like mold, and that's going to grow in your plant. So you definitely don't want to do that. So hopefully now you have a better idea of how to look after Venus flytraps for healthy, mature plants. Or at least now you have more confidence to go out there and try to grow one at home. They're not that hard to look after. Just follow those basic care guidelines that I discussed and you'll be fine. I'd love to hear from your experiences with Venus flytraps, past and present, so by all means leave a comment. Now before we go, we're just going to do a quick flyover over my nursery just to give you an idea of how my plants are looking like right now. It's the start of autumn. There's been a lot of insects that have been caught. There really is a jungle out there.